Oh God, as we gather in your name, again, we are grateful for an opportunity to study and to be together to fellowship. What we pray, Lord, is that in this time of study, it also becomes a time of reflective learning, so that it's not just learning what the Gospel of John says and all the issues that are around interpretation, but that it's applied to the level of our life in such a way that ends up resulting in change inside of us. That's what we do when we study, is we offer ourselves, we offer our minds and our hearts to you in hope what your Spirit does is work inside of us so that the nature of Christ is formed. And we want that. We want that for ourselves. We want that for the people that are around us, and ultimately for the world. And so we give you our lives, and we do it in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, so we're right at the very end of John chapter 11. It's been a couple of weeks since we've met with the Gospel of John due to Holy Week and due to, I was out of town last week. So we're going to pick this up at the end of chapter 11, verse 55. And my design over the next 4 weeks is to move at a pretty fast clip. So so we're going to do our best to finish John. Yeah, you got to have dreams, right? Yeah. So I mean, if you don't at least get it to the hole, it never goes in, right? So, all right. So let's look at 55. And now what the text says is, now the the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think, that he will not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he or she should let them know, so that they might arrest him. Now this is a sort of a summary statement, or some level of causation for what happened earlier in chapter 11. Chapter 11 has to deal with the raising of Lazarus, and because of that, the way we ended Jesus is praying before he goes to the tomb to raise Lazarus. And what we suggested 2 weeks ago was that what he's doing is he's working on the inside of himself so that he has resolve. Because the moment he raises Lazarus is the moment that really triggers no longer a passive desire to arrest Jesus. Now it becomes a very active desire to arrest Jesus, because he's a threat now. The people, this is a no turning back moment for Jesus. And so 55 through the rest of the chapter, just John, the gospel writer, has given us some insight into this active style of seeking after Jesus, instead of just sort of watching and maybe looking for an opportunity to maybe trick him, or to get him to say something or do something that would put him in violation of the law. Here he is. They're looking to find him. So it is getting close to the Passover, and there's desires of whether or not he'll be there. So there's a great sense of buzz. When we get into chapter 12, we're going to see that it's not just the religious leaders who are looking. There are people who are coming to Jerusalem, God-fearers, or maybe people who are on the outside, Greeks. And they are interested in meeting this Jesus as well, because his fame now is growing, mainly because of what he has done in the form of miracles and in the forms of who he's reaching out to and how he's doing that. So this sort of caps the end of 11. Now when we get into chapter 12, the story continues. So if somebody would read for us 12:1 through 12:11. All righty.
6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, for on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and putting their faith in him.
All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start with the 9 through 11 verse, and then we'll go back and catch the first part. The 9 through 11 gives you some more of the the consequences of what happened since the raising of Lazarus. And this is why Jesus is a threat. Not only is there a large crowd that's there that are looking for Jesus, but even people inside the ranks of the leadership are starting to jump, to move over into following Jesus because of what he's doing. And that's all a result from what they've been watching so far in the Gospel of John. But really, when Lazarus is raised from the dead, that's it. This is a defining moment in the ministry of Jesus. It's a defining moment in John's Gospel, and it's a point of no return for what Jesus is doing. And the fact that Bethany was only 2 miles from Jerusalem, this is within shouting distance. And so you can see that this is not something that happened way out in the provinces or out way up in the country. This happened on the doorstep of Jerusalem, on the doorstep of the Passover. And so the population of Jerusalem, some years could even grow to 100-fold during Passover week. And so people are already starting to move into Jerusalem leading up to what's going to happen for the week-long celebration of Passover. And, oh yeah, by the way, on the way in, guess what happened? This guy's raised from the dead. And, you really can't undo that if you think about it. This is, and so the news is just out and out and out. What would happen if, just think about what happens when we, they didn't have Facebook or emails or anything like that, but, particularly when someone is either dying or in this case even dead, you can't really stop that message, once it happens. We see, when someone is hurting or just think about all the conversation we just had a couple of minutes ago around people who had surgeries, and really we're not even thinking about life or death. We're just thinking about recovery, and so naturally, human beings lean towards that type of care and concern. That's been something that's been all throughout history. And then for something like this to happen, you can see that this is front page news, and it's a dividing of the house, at least among the leaders.
It was significant, too, that he'd been dead for 3 days.
Right, that's right. Actually 4. And 3 days was the limit. There was a thought that in that day that, you're not surely dead until you've been dead for 3 days. All right, yeah, you're not really dead. Yeah, it's you're just kind of half dead or 3/4 dead or whatever, but you're really, really dead after 3 days. And but in this case, 4 days. So it's beyond deniable now, and so that's what we have going on. And so you can see at the end of chapter 11, and then you have these 3 verses, 9 through 11, in chapter 12, that again underscore underscore the magnitude of the moment with what Jesus is doing. But in between those 2 little passages, the end of 11 and then 9 through 11 in chapter 12, we've got this story of where Jesus is still in Bethany, and he's still at Mary and Martha's house, And of course, Lazarus is there, and they're having a formal meal. Now, the reason that we know that it's not just the average meal is because in verse 2 it talks about a dinner, and then it continues to say that they're reclining. All right, that's normally an indication that it's not just an average meal. I mean, there was really one big meal a day inside their life, and they would have, they would eat, but there was one big meal, and this is a little more formal than just the big family meal because they're reclining. That's the indication. That's just the way they talked about more of a formal setting. So this is somewhat of a thank you dinner. What would you do if you're Mary or Martha, and your brother's surely dead, right? And all of a sudden he's not, and Jesus is still hanging out at the house. You got to have something a little bit more formal, right? Break out the china, and this is not paper plates, right? And trays before the TV. So it's a level of a formal meal. And how much do we know about the meal itself from these 7 verses, 8 verses? What's really advertised or what's highlighted in this passage? All right, hang on. Yeah, exactly right. What was done? What Mary did to Jesus, and not so much the meal itself. I mean, all we know is that it's a formal meal because they're reclining, and that there are other people that are there. But what's stressed in the passage is not, we don't even know what they're serving food-wise. We don't know who's there. We just know that somewhere along the lines in the dinner, we don't know if it's at the beginning, at the end, in the middle, but Mary pours the nard on the feet of Jesus. Now, we also know what about the nard? It's expensive. How much is 300 denarii? Does anybody want to take a stab at it? Yeah, it's a year's income. So, whatever your annual income is, that's how much it costs. And that's what the gift is. And what does she do with the bottle? She breaks it. She uses all of it. You're right, Marilyn. There's nothing left. And then what does she do after she anoints his feet? Right. All right. So we're going to have a foot washing service at the end of this class, and we're not going to have any towels. So you're going to dry people with your hair, right? Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So if you draw my name, good luck. All right. So you can do a little better with Slade. He's got a little more hair than I do, but. Just you can see the level of intimacy and the level of devotion and gratitude that's going on. And she's doing this for gratitude for what Jesus did with Lazarus. Yeah, exactly. Both of them are there. Both of them are a part of this. Yeah, exactly right. And she's Martha, and. Well, both of them, throughout the passage, if you go back to chapter 11 and to 12, both Mary and Martha have dispositions of a servant. There's certain, when they, Martha goes to Jesus first before Mary. Mary goes first and then Martha, but Martha's answers around the verse 38. She gives answers of faith. She gives answers that the disciples will give. And so both of them, if you look at the whole of this passage, both of them have characteristics of being a disciple. So it's not that one is more faithful than the other, or, breaking the nard that Mary does in chapter 12 is more important than what Martha did in chapter 11. I think that's that's not an accurate conclusion to draw. And because if you were to look at just 38 through 44, you don't see anything with Mary. This is in in chapter 11. It has nothing to do with Mary, so I mean, you have to look at the whole of the Lazarus corpus, okay? So you've got all of chapter 11 and then into chapter 12. Both of them have aspects of discipleship, characteristics of being a disciple. And this particular dinner, Mary is the one that comes and gives the nard. It might even be the families. I mean, this is it's a little bit different inside of. I mean, it was very communal in the family structure, more so than what we have today. I mean, you really didn't have like, this is Shane's room and Brooke's room and Connor's room and Caroline's room and all that. You didn't. I mean, it was just the homes were different back then. I mean, basically, you had one big room, and then you would build. If you had a son, and he was to marry, well, then she would be invited to come live inside the family, Casa de Green, right? And and then what you would normally do is just build on the top level. Well, guess what? Son and his wife and their family's on top level. You're on the bottom level. And during what you would do is, I mean, you just had a giant room where you'd all sleep together. Your animals would be there, all your belongings. I mean, it was just different than what it is today. And during the day, you just took it all out and laid it out in front of your house, and then at night you brought it back in. And but the animals, they would live right there with you. And it's not like you had a pasture in the back. And just everything was a little more communal than what it is today. Our society is very individualistic, and that's a modern trend. Now, when I say modern, like that's one of the results of the Enlightenment, age of Enlightenment. I mean, the Western culture, stuff like that, the birth of all that. It was before then. Society was more communal, and so it's a little bit different than our day. So the nard could have been Mary's and Martha's. Could have just belonged to the family. It could have been retirement. I mean, this is they didn't have 401ks. They didn't have IRAs and banks and whatnot. I mean, you just bought things that were real expensive and sold it when you needed it more than anything else. But what you got is what we have here is obviously some level of devotion that is given by Mary, and this is what is highlighted in this entire dinner, not what they're eating, not what's going on, and we got some opposition. So what's going on once this event takes place? Mary breaks the pound of nard. She breaks open the jar, pours it all on Jesus' feet, wipes, cleans up with her own hair. Can you imagine the smell? The what? Probably. Yeah, I mean that's too much, isn't it? I mean, if you spray one more spray than what's required, normally it's nice and tasty, isn't it? So, can you imagine what this is like? So, verse 4, what happens? Judas has allergies, doesn't he? Because he's protesting. What's he protesting? That it smells bad? Yes, wasteful. The audacity of Mary, right? To waste all this in some form or fashion because she's grateful. That's interesting. We don't have any problems with that, do we? I didn't think so. So let's keep on going. But Judas is upset. We get a little bit of insight for why Judas is upset. Is because he's pure of thought, right? No.
He's the treasurer.
That's exactly right. And he's paying the bills. Well, he could be stealing. Yep, he is. Right. There's a couple of times that shows up in the Gospels, not just John. the synoptics mention that as well, and that Judas was the treasurer of the group and paid the expenses. But how does Jesus respond? Does he call out Judas? No. So the minor part in this is not that Judas, the minor part is not, it is Judas. The major part is Mary. Jesus is really not concerned with what Judas is doing. Correct? He doesn't call him out for saying, shame on you, Judas, you're greedy, and what you really wanted is just to skim a portion of this. That's really not on, John, the gospel writer, gives us commentary, but this is not even something on Jesus' radar screen. What Jesus is talking about is not the fact that Judas might skim from the top, but just when Judas makes some level of question about should we not have given this to the ministry to help the poor, his response is not, Judas, there's something wrong with you, as much as to say that even when it comes to the poor, and the gospel, just so that you know, all four gospels slant towards the poor. It does. It is. It's not that people are more important. Okay, it's level ground at the cross. But if you go back and look at if you look at what Jesus says to those that have the ability to help others, particularly those that can't, and in the Gospels that's the poor. And inside the poor would be the poor, the lame. It would be just, all the things that come with poverty. I remember a seminary professor asking me, and I was really uncomfortable with it, but he asked me, he said, do you think that the gospel has special treatment for the poor? Well, I was like, I don't want to hear that, because what's the poor? Is that the poverty line in the United States? If that's the case, then is that different in the South than it is the North and the West? Is that United States compared to Europe? Is it Western culture compared to other cultures? Is it the Western Hemisphere? The lines between, what's the poor? Whenever we say that, like when we say we're going to end poverty, isn't that one of the Columbus desires? We want to change poverty by a certain level. Well, what's poverty? What is it defined by a number?
The inability to cope.
Well, if that's the case, then we're all poor, because what she said was the inability to cope with problems. We would all be poor there. Is it? I'm not defining poverty. I don't, because I don't know what it is. I just know that there is a treatment towards poverty in the Gospels that's different. And to some level it is subjective, if I had to guess, because poverty in Jesus' day is different than poverty in our day. I'll never forget reading there was some missionary reflections in some journals where there was a guy that was a missionary to, I think it was E. Stanley Jones, missionary to India, and he was talking to people, and there was one person in the crowd that said he wanted to go to the United States where poor people are fat. And I thought, okay, all right, point taken. Who knows what the number is for poverty in every situation. But Jesus is stressing that there will be poverty all over the place, but in this particular case, what Mary is doing is not harmful because she is edifying Jesus. And you have to see the distinction there with what's going on. It's not that Jesus didn't object in principle to the sale of the goods for the benefit of the poor. Jesus didn't devalue the poor or trivialize their life or their plight. So what did Jesus mean when he said that the poor would always be with him? Was it to say work with the poor is pointless Absolutely not. It was to contrast himself with the poor. And the disciples would have other times to honor and to care for the poor, but did not have another time to honor and care for him. And that's different. And it's not an excuse to say, in Mark chapter 7, now we studied Mark, 4 or 5 years ago, so you got to dust that off a little bit. In Mark chapter 7, there is where people are calling the disciples on the carpet because they're not washing their hands correctly before they eat. And so Jesus begins to talk to them that says, you're making something about washing hands is a minor issue. The real issue is that your hearts are far from me. And he actually quotes from the Old Testament. I think it's from the book of Isaiah. It says, your lips glorify me, but your heart is far from me. So it's not something that we could say, well, I'm going to be like them. I'm going to church, so I can't pay attention to other people or anything like that because I got to go to church. It's the same type of principle there, and same type of issue. Because the flip side of this could be, well, I love me some Jesus so much, I don't have to love anybody else.
But wasn't it a forerunner too of his being involved?
Yeah, I mean, later you get some commentary on that. That what he actually says in verse 6, 7. Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial." All right, so you get some level of insight into that, because if you think back to Luke 24, this is the text we used at Easter. Some of the women were getting up early in the morning to go after the Sabbath is over with, so that they could go with all the spices and whatnot to prepare his body for burial, because they weren't able to do that on the front end. So there is some level of theological, preparation here, which fits in with the honor concept. There'll be plenty of time to care for others. At this particular time, Jesus is in the midst. This is similar to the parable that's, I think, in Luke as well. It's either Luke or Mark, where the bridesmaids, they're waiting for the groom in the party, and they have their wicks and their oil. It says, "Don't let your lamp go out." Some of them have it, some don't, because they miss the coming of the groom. This is similar to this. The groom is here. So pay attention to the groom, or pay attention to Jesus. So this text. The reason why I'm spending some time with this, a good bit of time, is because this is often used or misused when it comes to ministry with the poor, or ministry because you want to do something else and you don't want to do ministry with the poor. And what we can't do is co-opt the text. We have to let the text sit for itself. And it's not that Jesus is trying to say loving him is more important than ministry to the poor. This is a very specific text to those people at this dinner for what Mary is doing. He is not trying to say that we're absolved from our responsibility as followers of Christ when it comes to people who are in need. That's there. My best advice would be, if Jesus shows up in your midst, then you get a free pass. But until then, we don't. All right? So any comments or questions about this dinner? His death was fast approaching, to Bitsy's comment, and Mary's act of devotion had served to underscore, though unknowing to her, the nearness of his death and burial.
And Shane, apparently these people were very close to Jesus.
Sure.
And he was probably so touched
Right.
by her actions toward him.
Sure.
That he, wanted to express how he felt for what she had done.
Right. I mean, because there are, Judas does call her out. All right. So I mean, with Mary, what you have is probably a couple of things going on. I mean, there's deep affection towards Jesus. Anyways, we knew that on the front end when Lazarus was dying. Both sisters go to Jesus and express their love and care for him and the closeness that Jesus had with their family. The fact that Lazarus is raised is, so then you just got this whole other aspect of gratitude because of, without Jesus, Lazarus would be dead. And so it is it's a multifaceted level of affection and appreciation and gratitude towards Jesus. And so you can see the level of devotion and care and the idea that, the costly nard, is rightly given because of what happened. What's the price you pay in gratitude for your family? You tell me. That's exactly right. what's, 1 year's salary? All right. That's it? I feel like I'd be getting off free then, So, but, there's all of us would have paid that price. When it came to children or siblings or what have you. So Mary, whether or not Mary knew fully what she was doing in context to Jesus' death and burial, probably not. But you can see the act of devotion that was given, and how. And another thing too, the level of faith that ties into family and relationships. Think about your own life. Now, this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, so we're not going to go too far into this, but I want you to reflect on this in the days to come. If you look at it in terms of, you got your family and just those circles or whoever it may be, and separate. It's hard to separate. Well, this is the love for them, and then this is the love that I have for God. All right? And they're just kind of separated. That's not how it works, correct? Normally what happens, it's more like, it's more like this. They're just, those circles are kind of mixed together where, it's not to say that, you're highlighting one or the other, but, if you ask me how to separate my faith in God and my love for God and my love for my family and my care for them, I can't. My faith is woven into that as much as anything else. And so the fact that Mary, with love for Jesus, love for Lazarus, faith in Jesus, her whole religious life, you can see how all that is just mixed in together. And just an act of devotion and care and love. If you were to sit and to ask Mary, if we could interview her and say, okay, Mary, how much of this was because you believed in Jesus? And then how much of this is because you were, you're just so thankful to have one more meal with your brother? And how much of this is because, you want to illustrate to everybody what it's like to be a disciple? You can't answer that. It's all woven together. And that faith has this wonderful, one of the images that is used for the Holy Spirit is water. You ever tried to stop water from kind of, some of you have water problems in your house, We have water problems in our church, right? Trying to get a handle on that one, right? Water just has this ability to flow into wherever it wants to flow. And your faith is like that. And so to separate that from, this is my love for God, and this is my love for Brooke, and this is my love for Connor. It's just all woven together. And I count on that. I count on, God to be as active in that, in me and in them. We have teenagers now, all right? So that's always interesting. And, You know, so one of the things that I do at night when I go and tell my Connor and Caroline good night, and you know, last night we were thinking about Anna Few and wanted to pray for her, and because I know what it's like to be a teenager, I know what my life was like when I was a teenager. You know, often, you know, one of my comments to them is, just leave a little bit of space open for God. All right? Because you're testing now. Okay? I get that. And probably for the next, you know, through college and whatnot, there'll be that testing of what it, you know, of them learning to stand on their own feet without mom and dad. And so I have no grand illusions that my children are going to be perfect. I mean, they're far from it. And I mean, thankfully, you're a church that does not put them in a fishbowl, and I really mean that. And so they have freedom to figure out what it means for them to be a young man and for them to be a young woman. And so they're figuring that out. And so we were, you know, last night was, you know, they just, you know, pray for Anna. And I said, you know, and don't give up on the power of prayer and the power of what God can do in your life. Even if it is right now just that much, that's fine. That's all, you know, just leave a little bit of space open and see what develops. Because they're learning, it's not that they're bad children by any stretch, I'm very proud of my son and my daughter, but they're learning to balance what it means for them to get out of the shadow of their dad, whose job is dependent upon faith in God. And that's his life. And so they didn't choose that. I chose that. Okay? And so for them trying to figure out who they are and what that's about, there needs to be a level of freedom for them to cut their own path, make their own mistakes, in hopes that all the things that we tried to pour into them when they were younger, I mean, I count on God to own that. And that, you know, if there is a time or a season where they would say, Dad, what you believe and what I believe are not the same, you know, number one, I don't want to jump off the deep end when I hear that. But then at the same time, I just want to say, okay, that's fine. You just leave a little bit of space for the possibility of that God can do the things that God says. And I mean, you know, and I've seen this a million times. I mean, I see people who journey back. Now, it takes others longer than some. But I mean, I count on that Philippians verse that he who began a good work in you will bring that to completion, even if it's something I can't see. And so, you know, just leave a little space open is all I ask for them to do. And it's Philippians 1, maybe 7, 8, or 9, or 10, or whatever. It's in the prayer from 3 to 11. That's Paul's prayer for the Philippians. So, all right. Well, we got to really speed up. So let's take a break to gather our resources for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we're going to move. All right, let's go ahead and come together if we can. All right, we're going to go ahead and press on. I know we still have a few that aren't here. The good news is that the next passage, verse 12 through 19, is fairly straightforward because it has to do with the triumphal entry. It says, the next day the large crowd that had come to the feast heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, crying, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. And Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, just as it is written, Fear not, daughters of Zion, behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. His disciples did not understand these things at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things had been written about him and had been done to him. The crowd had been with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead, continued to bear witness. The reason why the crowds went to meet him was that they had heard that he had done this sign. So the Pharisees said to one another, You see that you are gaining nothing. Look, the world has gone after him. So again, one of the things that John's, the gospel writer, does here is he is equating a number of these events seen through the eyes of the leaders who, in post-raising of Lazarus, you can see people starting to gravitate more and more towards Jesus as compared to before he raised Lazarus. I mean, just Jerusalem itself is buzzing with Jesus and the miracles that he has performed, particularly the one with Lazarus. What's interesting, too, is when we get into verse 20, is that you even have Greeks who are on their way to Jerusalem to worship, who don't know Jesus, but they catch wind of this, and obviously they want to figure out what's going on and to at least meet Jesus for themselves. But Jesus now does enter the city, so this would be Holy Week for us, and this John's Gospel is in line with the Synoptics. Remember, the Synoptics are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that on his way in, people do respond as seeing him as the coming King of Israel, and respond in like manner with the branches and the crying out from the book of Psalms, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So Jesus gets into the city, and then if someone will pick up and read for us verse 20 through 26. Not all at once.
Now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the feast. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. Sir, they said, we would like to see Jesus. Philip went to tell Andrew. Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. Jesus replied, The hour has come, the Son of Man to be glorified. I tell you the truth, unless the kernel of wheat is lost to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. The man who loves his life will lose it. The man who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me. And where I am, a servant also will be. Until the honor the one who serves me. Keep going.
To verse 26.
That's it.
Yep, all right, good. So Jesus is in the city. You have to see the progression of thought here. There are Greeks who are going up to worship. That's odd that Greeks are coming to Jerusalem during the Passover, isn't it? What's that about? Do y'all know? Anybody want to take a stab? The God-fearers, that's right. Good answer. That's like I tell you what, God-fearers, and in the book of Acts, Luke in Acts is the one that really gives insight into this. Cornelius, you remember that story in Acts? Cornelius is called a God-fearer, but he's also a Greek. And there were certain Greeks who obviously are not Jewish, but adopted Judaism as their religion. And so you have some here already that are doing that. This predates Cornelius. But there are some who are coming into...
So that means they're monotheistic, right?
Yep, exactly right. Because most of the time in the New Testament, when Greeks are... I mean, the house is divided between Jews and Greeks. That's just kind of pagans and Christians, and stuff like that. And so it's just very generic polarizations of people. And Greeks would have been those without some level of description, either as God-fearers or on their way to worship or what have you. They would have, the New Testament would have just interpreted them as being polytheistic, as tied to the whole Greek religious world and all the gods and goddesses and whatnot. But there were some who adopted Judaism as their religion. And that would be these that are mentioned in the text. So they're going up to the temple to worship, to participate and to celebrate Passover on the way in. Again now, they're, Jerusalem, well, that map doesn't work, but Jerusalem, there are cities that are, these outlying cities that are very close to Jerusalem, and Bethany being one, which is where Lazarus was raised. The buzz is going, his fame is out there, and so they would have heard of what Jesus did, and so they want to find out, what's going on. And so they obviously could not get to Jesus, so they go to Philip. And Philip, they make a request to Philip. Philip then goes to Andrew. Andrew and Philip then go to Jesus. What does Jesus do? Does he give them the time of day? Are we sure? Yeah. He doesn't meet with them. We don't know if he meets with them. The text doesn't tell us that if he does or he doesn't. Now, his answer is something for us to look at. The answer, truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. That's his first part. And then he gives some commentary. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. This first part of the answer where it says the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified is an interesting answer. There's debate on whether or not they actually really thought that they would be able to meet Jesus. But they make a request. Philip gives a request to Jesus. We don't really know what they wanted of Jesus. All it says is that some Greeks wanted to see him. And we don't know if Jesus granted their request and actually met with them. It's just not part of the passage in the story that we have. And if he did, we don't know what took place in that meeting. But there is a connection to what Jesus says about the hour of the Son of Man. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified, verse 23. That does sit with, in some level, this idea of Greeks and Jews coming to God. The issue is not what they asked of Jesus or what Jesus said, but that the fact that Greeks are now seeking Jesus. That's what we know from the text. And this isn't the first time that that's mentioned, okay? There are other times where in the gospel where Jesus gives an indication that his life and his ministry and ultimately his death will be for the whole world, not just for Israel. In John 10:16, he'd already mentioned something about other sheep to be gathered as one flock. Well, that has a connotation that there's more than just one type of sheep. In 11:52, Jesus does talk about dying for the scattered children of God. So what's interesting here is we have some level of evidence that there are other people than just Jews who are coming to Jesus. So we don't know anything about the meeting, if they met, if they did meet, what was that about. But what we do know is that what is talked about in the Old Testament is that that a suffering servant will draw all people to God. And you have an example of this, that it's not just Jewish, but now you also have Greeks who are coming into the fold as well. So even though we don't know if he met for sure, we do know that his answer is to the question that they're asking. That the hour is at hand for the Son of Man to be glorified. And at that hour, both Jew and Greek would be drawn to God. The glorification of Jesus. Also notice that it's the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Is Jesus referring to his death, or is he referring to the resurrection?
I don't know, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Who wants to be glorified in their death?
Right.
And it's a weird,
It is.
convicted, crucified, and trying to shut the whole world up.
Right. The good news is that he gives us an answer, is that unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. So the emphasis is on his death, not on his resurrection. And so the level of glorification that Jesus is referred to, at least in this passage, is his death. Now, to Slade's credit, there are other passages that talk about if he's raised up again. And so then he's talking about resurrection. But at least here, what he's referring to is the glorification that shows up in his death. Jesus welcomed his death not because he believed in a cosmic principle that life follows death, or that there'll be this rejuvenating power of nature or anything like that, but that he has committed himself to the obedience to the Father, from Jesus, and Jesus has already said this in chapter 5 verse 21 and 26, is that the Father is the source of life. So Jesus is referring to his death here, and in doing so, that is a level of obedience and commitment that Jesus has to the will of God. Now, we get some further insight into this, because not just does he talk about the grain of wheat falling to the ground and dying, but if it dies, then it bears much fruit. We also get this idea of commentary now, where how it involves other people. Whoever loves his life loses it. Whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he will follow me, and where I am, there will my servants be also. If anyone serve me, the Father will honor him. So there's a couple things going on here that's interesting. The idea of a person loving his life or loves his life will keep it for eternal life. There's some level of thought and some truth with this. The fundamental assumption from Jesus is not that he's devaluing human beings. Okay? Actually, Jesus has a high valuation of humans, but the final goal towards everything aims at not self-destruction and a self-contempt, but eternal life. All right, you see that in the text? The goal is not just that you have to devalue yourself and empty yourself, as much as what people receive if they're willing, if they give their life, what they receive is eternal life. Hatred and love stand together in this particular passage as sort of like opposite ends of the spectrum, maybe even as figures of speech expressing radical difference between the two ways of life. One could love their life and will seek to love it at all costs, to preserve it and to protect it from risk and danger, from scorn and rejection. Or someone would hate their life, which means that they would do the opposite of preserving it and loving it and caring for it. And so you see that he's created these dichotomies of loving and hating. Loving and hating a life do not stand as abstract principles on some levels, because it all is seen in context to how your life relates to Jesus. Because if not, then a skydiver or someone like that would qualify as a hater of his life, right? Or her life, since he or she is willing to embrace all types of danger and may even indeed suffer ridicule from a worried family, or maybe the chute won't open. So it's not just people who don't care or give any aspect to the value of their life, or people who just value their life over everything else. All of that is seen in context to what you do with your life in reference to Jesus. Do you see the difference? Because if not, then when you go back into some of the synoptics and you look at some of the passages that say, well, if your hand sins, do what? Cut it off. And if your eye, all right, so we ain't got any eyes plucked out here. And we all got our hands, so that's not us. It's the Bible study next door over there. And, if it's just about loving and hating and what that means just in general, but not in what it means to God, then, you're more inclined to do that. Do y'all remember, you have to go back to some of your history lessons, and again, that could be painful. I get it, history. Zorba the Greek. Did you ever have to read that? All right, Zorba the Greek has a story. Yeah, it was a movie too, but it's actually as a play. There's a story in some of the writings of that where he meets this fisherman who doesn't have a thumb, and the fisherman would have to make his hooks, and the fisherman understood that he could really make the hooks that he wanted, but his thumb kept getting in the way of trying to carve it. And so because he wanted to make the hooks so that he could catch the fish, he gladly cut his thumb off. All right? Now we think, oh my gosh, it's horrible. But that's the concept of the idea of cutting your hand off or plucking your eye out, or this loving and hating of the life as it's compared to this particular text. It's not self-mutilation. I mean, if that's the case, then the skydiver analogy would be in my mind, I don't care to skydive at all, the epitome of what it means to hate your life. I mean, just to throw caution to the wind or whatever. I know I want to do something, and I know that I can't do it because there's certain things that are in my way. And if those things are in my way when it comes to God, I'll gladly just get rid of it, because I want this more than even I would want that. And that's what sacrifice is. You know what sacrifice is? Something of great value that you have. You just give that up for something of greater value. And so this is what Jesus is getting at in these levels of these dichotomies. Because all of it is seen in reference to God. And what Jesus is saying, even because he's using himself as the example, even if life, I mean, what else would be more important for us, right? To give that up for I love that, but I gladly sacrifice that because I want this more. That's what he's getting at in this passage. And then he even goes so far to say that the people, verse 26, the people who serve me must do as I do. The idea of being willing to, that if there's something that stands in conflict to following God, at some point you have to ask, what's more important? That's a sobering question, okay? I get that. But if I know that I want to, if making the hooks get me closer to God, and I really can't make the hooks because my left thumb gets in the way, then at some point I have to pay attention to, what then for me is of the greater value. Is it to preserve what is the obstruction to getting to Jesus, or is it getting to Jesus? Now, he doesn't define what those things are, all right? Which would probably that'd probably be easier, wouldn't it, if he did? But what Jesus is is doing is expressing to his disciples that even if your life becomes the stumbling block, whatever that would be, at some point you've got to rectify what really is of most importance to you. And do we preserve something that stands in the way, or are we willing even to give that up for the following of Jesus? You know, now, in our day and time, it's a little bit, this gets fairly murky because we don't really live with persecution. I mean, we don't. Not in the real sense of what persecution is. We don't like it when politics change or whatever. I mean, and we think that's persecution. That's not. Persecution is when you lose your life, lose your possessions. I mean, that's persecution for faith. In about, let's see, I mean, to follow Jesus at this point puts your life in jeopardy. And that's pretty much that way for the next 300 years. Now, in around 320, it changes because Constantine passes an edict which allows Christianity to be an approved religion. Early 300s, 320, 325 is when it becomes the official religion. But it goes from being approved to the official religion in the span of about 2 decades. But for about 260 years, this is not, I mean, this is, all it would take is someone to go down to the local magistrate and say, yeah, O'Shane's a Christian. And then you would be investigated, and if found guilty, you would either have to recant or renounce your faith, thrown in jail, or even die, just depending on what levels of the very conservative provinces you died. The very liberal provinces, you could pay your way out of it or what have you. But I mean, that's that, how many of us, I mean, when you woke up, you were trying to plot your way to St. Paul so that you would not be arrested? Probably not. You probably had to pass 10 churches to get here, So I mean, we just live in a different time, and thankfully so. Now, what that does then is which when we have to think about these particular passages, I mean, it creates some. It's cloudy because it's not as cut and dry as what it was in the first century. The first century was, when you look at the book of Revelation, one of the letters goes to a city. One of the city received the contracts to build the emperor's temples. All right, it was a union, had to have a trade guild. In order to work, you had to have your union card. Well, they controlled the union cards and they held the contracts. Well, they were not Christians. And so to be a Christian could put you in a place where you could not work. And so you have that particular letter was, stay the course. Well, I mean, do you do that? I mean, do you stay the course if it meant to follow Jesus and you couldn't get a job? I mean, now it could be easier for ourselves, all right, but then when you start thinking about the people that you care for, I mean, so you see it's different today. Now, I'm not saying it's easier, I'm just saying it's different. And I'm definitely not saying this text doesn't apply to us and only apply to them. It applies to us just as much as it applied to them. It's just not as cut and dry as what it was back then, which makes it harder for us on some levels. But we don't live in a day where we really think about losing our life for faith. I mean, most...
But in the Muslim country?
Oh, yeah, I'm talking about us. I'm talking about just us. I'm not talking about outside of Western culture. I mean, there are, very much. I've got a buddy of mine he's a missionary in the Muslim world. And, and even when not so smart people get up and make public statements that are just asinine, it puts them on lockdown for 60 days. I mean, someone who's burning the Quran or whatever and making some stupid comments, and then the media puts them up as a national news. Well, it affects people 30, 60, 90 days. Some of them die because of it. All right, so I mean, just this, and people who make those comments, and you can see my level of passion on this, they don't have a clue. And they think they're doing something good for God. They're not. I mean, they're grandstanding more than...
You're saying that the person that burned the Koran is not doing something good for God. Is that the way?
Yeah, that's 100% what I'm saying. Okay, I mean, I'm just telling you. Now, that's my personal views here. 100% not doing something good for God. What it does, it makes it harder for the mission. All right, because we live in a very easy society and an easy world, at least when it comes to our faith. Now, the negative is that we can become very watered down. All right, where we lose the we lose the line between, to use John's language, the world and our faith. They sort of kind of get mixed together. Now that can be helpful on some levels because you already have insight into culture, insight into power structures or what have you, and then your faith can be a style of witness that can bring change, as opposed to if you're in a stark minority in a different part of the world, and where faith, I mean, if you be, and it's not just people who, just Christians who move to Muslim world. If you're in certain parts of the world, if you grow up in a Islamic family and you profess Christ, you are either banished, excommunicated, or even put to death. I mean, just depending on how level of the levels of how conservative they are inside of their Islamic beliefs. It's just different for us, and on some level it's easier. But on some levels, we're the poorer for it. So you have to see the historical context that went on for about 300 years inside the life. So when Jesus says, "Losing your life for my sake," what does that mean? Don't go to the school I want to go to or something. I mean, but in other cases, it really meant loss of life.
It does make me think, though, of the prayer of John Wesley that you gave
Sure,
early.
sure.
I'm no longer...
Mine but thine, put me to what? Yep.
Yes, that one, because it really is, well, I'll say that impressed me. I'm a new
Sure.
Methodist, early New Methodist, and had not heard that before. And I shared it with my daughter-in-law, who is a very strong Christian, and I thought, this is really great, this is nice, she's going to appreciate this. And she said, wow, this is a hard prayer.
Right,
But
sure.
it struck me.
Right.
I had not really thought about how hard it is. But that's the modern, to me, the modern day, modern in the sense of for the last...
Right. Well,
years.
another example would be, I've got a friend of mine that they're here in Columbus. They've been praying about this for a few years. They're about to relocate to start a church in New Mexico. All right. So, I mean, it's leaving all their structures, family. Well, case in point in your family, Judith, too. So there are, I mean, those would be examples of what it means to give up or lose or sacrifice for something. And that's not the goal for everybody, okay? I mean, that's why it's easier and harder for us. But there are, and to some degree, they're just across the boards. I mean, to be a Christian, you can't do certain things. I mean, you can't. I mean, now you could, but you're not being obedient, all right? So, I mean, there are some things that we just can't do in our society. I mean, you cannot, or you should not do certain things. And the reason why you shouldn't is because you belong to Christ. And it affects how you talk, affects how you act, affects what you do with who you are, what you got, what have you. So there are some things that we sacrifice for, but that shouldn't be laborious. I mean, that shouldn't be something to where we're kind of upset with that. I mean, if anything, we should be the ones that would say, yeah, I'll gladly not talk a certain way, because if that's all I have to sacrifice for God, then I can work on my lazy vocabulary. Because somebody else, I mean, they might be dying. Or does that make sense? I mean, you have to see it inside of the scope of the world and the mission of the church, and we're only just a small portion of that here. But to be willing All right, so how do we make that first person for us? And it becomes a disposition on the inside, the idea to be willing to give up. You know, and we don't know until fully put to the test. I get that, but I mean, the idea of desiring more for the glorification of God than something that belongs to us. I mean, that's something that at some point we have to pay attention to.
Makes you think about all those wonderful people that died for us to be able to.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
You know, to, I never thought about that.
Well, I mean, you know, they're similar. Even, I mean, the idea of someone giving up of life for something else. I mean, that's they're asked. I mean, in the text, it has to do specifically with Jesus. Now we're benefits of that, and we're benefits of just people who've given their life for things that aren't necessarily Christian, but definitely have Christian juices sort of kind of rolling, you know, in the middle of it. You know, so I mean, there is a level of gratitude that comes with that, which somewhat loosely ties our country into the adage of being a Christian country or what have you. I mean, that's debated on both sides. But I mean, there are levels of freedom, there are levels of liberty and things like that we have here that other people don't have. And to some degree, whether or not it's 100% or 10% or what have you, did stem from people's understanding of the Christian faith. And those are good things. And I mean, we're receivers. You know, one of the reasons why pride is abhorred inside the Bible and humility is honored is because you think about pride has a tendency to draw the circle very small around just the person, and compared to a very broad kingdom approach to the world around. So I mean, you can see you see it in John's gospel, but you really see it in some of the epistles and whatnot. You know, at some point we all have to wrestle with this. You know, what is considered off limits to God, and you know, it's easier here, which makes it harder for us to draw that line. And but it's I mean, it's something that we have to consider, and it's at some point it still has to be a level of resolve that says, you know, God, you know, I'm at least willing, whatever that would be. All right, well, let's stop. We did not get to the point, so I'm gonna give y'all some homework. All right, just because you like it, and read through the rest. Read to verse 50 in your homework, and I want you to pay attention to two things. I want you to pay attention to the idea of particularly around verse 31, this idea of judgment and driving out, and sort of like the dividing of the house, and then this, and carry that on into verse 50 about belief compared to unbelief. Okay, and we'll now the good news. We'll get through 12 real quick at the beginning of next week. 13 through, I think, like 17 and a half, or maybe the end of 17, is just really, really good stuff because it's Jesus and his disciples. 13 cues the ending of his public ministry in the Gospel of John. And now from 13 on, it's all private. And so you're invited to the inside table, and you get insight into what it means for Jesus to be talking exclusively to his disciples. All right? Everybody good? Go in peace. May the Lord be with you.